Hello. In this video, we're going to review JavaScript and talk about some of the key features that you should keep an eye out for. So a quick disclaimer, this video is designed assuming that you already know programming, whether or not you've had much experience with JavaScript specifically. We're going to cover just the basics so that you can see what things maybe you might need to review before we start using JavaScript in a web programming context. So specifically, some of the things that we're going to talk about today are identifying the key features of JavaScript, what makes it different from every other language out there. We'll look really briefly at some common types of statements like declaration and assignment, how we write conditional logic and loops and functions, and just identify one or two stumbling blocks when people are writing JavaScript, things to keep in mind or things that people tend to forget. We'll see how we run JavaScript right on our computer without a browser, and make sure that you are ready to start writing your own JavaScript programs in our first modules. So to start us off, an explanation of JavaScript as a language. JavaScript is the lingua franca of the web. It is the common tongue that is used on every website. And it's pretty well suited for this because it is built to be the most pared down language possible. If you want JavaScript by the numbers, all of the descriptions of it, it is a dynamically typed, multi-paradigm, prototypal scripting language, which is a huge mouthful, but basically what that's saying is that just like Python or Ruby or Lua, JavaScript doesn't care all that much about data types. Your variables still have a data type. Strings are text, numbers are things like ints or floats, but it's going to try to infer based on how you're using a variable in the moment what type of data should be stored in there. When I say it's multi-paradigm, that means that while JavaScript takes a lot from languages like C, we've still got if statements and loops and functions. It also takes a little bit from everywhere. We've got the class keyword from object-oriented languages like Java. We've got map and reduce and filter functions taken from a functional programming language. And JavaScript even throws some of its own stuff into the mix. JavaScript invented this entire concept of prototypes, which work sort of like classes, except we can write them on the fly and rewrite them mid-program. We're not going to get too heavily into that part of JavaScript. One, because I am not teaching you hardcore programming languages in this course. Programming language theory is its own bear with its own reasons to study. But two, because prototypes are even a feature that JavaScript has its own love-hate relationship with. And in modern JavaScript, we tend to just use classes instead. Finally, JavaScript is a scripting language, which means you can just start writing statements. You don't need to compile your code. You don't need to write one class per file and organize everything around a main method. It is designed for rapid prototyping with the least amount of boilerplate possible. So that is sort of JavaScript by the numbers. That is the classification if we were talking about JavaScript in comparison to other languages. The basic building blocks of JavaScript are the same as pretty much any language you would use in a professional context outside of a research paper. We've got a couple basic instructions that let us describe our problem in pieces. First, we can create a named space for data. The act of declaring a variable, saying let, and then the name of the variable. We can save something into that variable, assigning my variable equals whatever value we want to put in there. We can create some condition, say when a particular condition is met, only then do I want to do something. That is an if statement. If, and then in parentheses, you put something that evaluates to true or false. We've also got a repeating construct, the ability to say while some condition is true, keep doing something over and over again. We can use while, and as you'll see in a moment, we can also use for to loop over something that is more well defined. Finally, in JavaScript, we've got the ability to say this block of instructions that I've created, I want to give it a name so I can refer to it by that shorthand later. That is a function. These are the basic tools that we've got in the language. And what I actually want to do now is take a moment and just run some JavaScript, run through some basic programming examples so you can see how we use these various constructs to solve slightly larger problems. So here in my IDE, I've got a place to type my JavaScript code, and then down at the bottom, I'm running a terminal. This is just like if you opened up your command prompt in Windows or terminal program in Mac or Linux. I've just got it down here right in frame so we can see it. But what I am going to start off with is I am going to try to just write some code that creates one of these variables. I'm going to say let some data row equals some variable that is some text that maybe I've pulled from the internet or I've pulled from a file. When I do this, I am creating a space for this. I am saving a value into it. And this is specifically string data here. So one good thing to keep in mind with JavaScript is when we define a variable, we don't need to know what type it is right off the bat, though we should still have a type in mind. One common mistake that I see a lot of novice JavaScript programmers make is they go and they start writing their code, and they're playing very fast and loose with their variables. They're just saving stuff into it, and something that on line 12 is a string, by the time we get to line 30 has suddenly become an integer. And later on, they go and add an if statement, and now it might be an integer or it might be a string, and they try to use it as one, but it's actually the other, and so their program crashes. What I'm trying to say by this is, even though JavaScript lets you just put this word let here to say there is a new thing called data row, and here's what I'm putting in it, you should still know in your head what kind of thing data row is going to be in this example. With this example of a string, strings are objects in JavaScript, which means we actually get a lot of helpful features attached right onto this string right when we create it. For instance, we can use dot functions. I can say this data row, I want to check what is the text at the beginning? Does it start with maybe the letters APP? Here I'm calling a function, specifically a method that is attached to this data row, and this is going to give me some result, some value true or false. And if I want to check that value, I can go print it out with the console.log function, say, does the data row start with APP? And when I concatenate this result onto it, if I say this is main.javascript, save this, then I can go and run my program. I can say bun main.js. You could also use Node if you've installed Node. But when I run this, it tells me the thing saved in this result variable here Is the value true? Yes, there is APP at the start of this text data. You'll notice one helpful thing that happened when I saved this as a JavaScript file in this editor. Suddenly, it gave me hints on what type of information is stored in each one of these variables. Some code editors will helpfully try to give hints about the types of variables. I don't want you to get confused by this. I have seen people watch a YouTube video of someone coding or see some screenshot of code and see this here and think they're supposed to type that. If I highlight, I can't actually even highlight this text directly. This text does not exist. When you see grayed out stuff like that in an editor, that usually means it's a hint, not actual syntax that you should be using in the language. But as we said, this console.log output lets us print out text when we do run a program. When I run it, that's the only thing that does appear right there in the terminal when I type the name of the file that I want to run. One last note right here on this first little example is that notice there are no functions. As I said before, JavaScript is a scripting language, so we can just start writing instructions right away. It doesn't need to belong to a function. I still typically recommend you organize your code into functions, but it actually takes the entire file and throws that file into an unnamed function when you try to run JavaScript in any JavaScript runtime. So you can just start experimenting with things right away, if that is the type of programmer that you are. So the next piece of JavaScript that I want to talk about is arrays. One of the functions that we've got on our string is the ability to take this data row and split it up. Say every time you see a comma, I want that to become a new string. And when I do this, now the thing saved in data pieces is equivalent to if I had typed out data pieces equals apple, comma, 199 inside these square brackets here. This is the syntax for a JavaScript array. You can literally describe one like this. You can use dot push on an empty array to put things into it, dot pop to pull things out of it. You can even use the square bracket notation to say, hey, I've got this thing. Let me grab the thing in slot 0. And like most languages, JavaScript arrays start from 0. This first entry is the number 0. The next one will be number 1. So if I wanted to grab the price, that's data pieces of 1. And so on. If there were 5, 6, 7 things in here, I would just keep counting up. If I wanted this to be a different data type, when I split my string, everything starts as a string. So I'm going to need to convert those pieces directly. There are parse functions like parse float, like parse int, that will let us take whatever type of data was there before and try to massage it from text into a float or an integer or a boolean. There's also a parse bool. And this will, as you see in the hint here, give me back, in this case, the numeric version of price, so that I've got price as a number. If I say wanted to add something to it, say price is what price was before plus an extra $1 because we are shrinkflating our grocery store. So that is a very expedited overview of JavaScript arrays. The next thing that I want to talk about is functions. So functions work like they do in most languages. What they are for is a way for me to say that I've got some task, some repeatable thing that I want to break off and give a name. To declare a function, I'm going to use the word function, type in some name for that function, and then type in the list of everything you need to give me if you want that function to run. You put the name and then all the inputs, one after another. If there's more than one, you separate them with a comma. Let's say in here, the thing I'm going to do for right now is just say, hey, this is going to split it up. And then at the end of the function, return whatever that thing is that is the final result of parsing the row in this case. So now I've created this function that really is just wrapping the split function. To call this thing, I can, on the right-hand side of an assignment or on its own line, type out that name again, and now provide all of the inputs. So I can say, hey, when I made this function, created this deal where you give me input data and I give you back the parts. Now when I'm calling the function, I need to hold up my end of the deal. I promised to give you that input data. My text data row here is the input data that I'm going to give you. This is calling the function, and doing this here tells the program, go run line by line. When you get here, jump to the function, finish all of that, and then jump back. Works like it does in most languages. If we want to spice this function up a little bit more, we can talk about JavaScript objects. So in addition to arrays, JavaScript has another very common representation of data, and that is a JavaScript object. A JavaScript object is similar to dictionaries in some other languages like Python. It's similar to ad hoc objects if there were no classes in a language like Java, although we'll see a closer analog to that in just a minute. But here, if I use these curly braces next to this result, I am saying I want to create a JavaScript object. And inside these curly braces, I have to put key value pairs. So I might say the name is the first one of these parts. And then I might say the price is the second one of these parts cast into a number. And if I do this, I've now created this one thing result that has two attributes. So here, these curly braces wrap all of those attributes in my object. Like we said, is just like a dictionary. And then each thing on the left of the colon is an attribute of the object. And then each thing on the right of a colon is the value held by that attribute. And that's going to be the general pattern for how, if I've got a bunch of pieces and I want to pass them all back at once, this is how you're generally going to do it in JavaScript. So let's say I actually want to break all this down and have this be part of parsing my row. Now the thing that this function returns is a result, and you can see this grocery variable that saves the result. My text editor has hinted to me that now what I'm getting back is actually this entire object that's got a name and a price. If I wanted to refer to the pieces of this, I can do so by taking that variable name, say, the grocery's name is grocery, and then I can put a dot and then the piece that I want. You can see there's a name here, there's a price here. So if I do grocery.name, then I am referencing just that piece of the whole object. And that dot notation might look familiar if you're coming from a background in an object-oriented language, but if not, you can just think of this as a way to refer to one individual row in your objects up here. If I go and run this, because we've written a bunch of code, we should run it, we can see now that this grocery that I got back, when I ask for just its name, I get just that name part of the original text. And that's really the benefit of these objects, is they give you a way to break down and compartmentalize different pieces of a complex piece of information. You can refer to these things in easy to remember and hard to mess up descriptors that do more than just having something like a square bracket 0, square bracket 1. It's really easy to forget what the 7th field of an array is. It's really hard to forget what name is for, as long as you've given name a meaningful name. The next thing that I do want to talk about is a way to make these objects a little bit more formalized. So when we know that the same kind of object will appear more than once in our program, when we know I'm going to have dozens or hundreds of these things, and I want to make sure that they all work the same way, we can create a template for these objects called a class. So a class is just a description of what things an object should have. Let's say I've got a class grocery here. This grocery class, I might say every grocery has a name, every grocery has a price. Technically, you don't even need to put the attributes here in JavaScript. You can just shove them in your constructor. But this lets us write what all of the pieces are of a grocery. And then in addition, we can actually attach entire behaviors to this thing. I can start writing functions like saying, when you get the price, I want to return this thing's price. Every class has one special function that you need to include when you write it, and that is the constructor function. The constructor function is a function that tells us how to set up one of these things. All classes need to have a constructor that does this. And typically, a lot of what these constructors are going to do is just say, well, this thing's first attribute is whatever you gave me as the first attribute. This thing's next attribute is whatever you gave me as the next attribute. We're going to take all of those function parameters, stuff them in our attributes. Maybe some have default values. The example I always use in my Java class is, oh, well, you know, a student starts with 0 absences, so I could just fill in this dot absences equals 0 right away. Not everything needs to come from those parameters, but this constructor's job is just to say, well, when you make a grocery, here's all the setup that happens behind the scenes. And the last little note about here, the last little thing to note here is that the keyword this in this function here indicates we want to modify an attribute, not just a local variable. The this says it's one of the pieces of information I defined up here that gets used across all of these functions. Also going to give myself a get name real quick. And you can see we use the this in this context as well to say that I'm referring to the same thing I did up here. But now that I've created this template of what a grocery should be, now whenever I want to make one of these things, rather than using those curly braces like we did back in our function, where I have to write out all of the attributes right there and make sure I'm using the same names I did before, instead, I can use this special keyword new, and say, well, I'm making a new grocery. And when I make a new grocery, I have to call the grocery constructor. And you can see my code editor even right now is telling me, okay, first you have to give me the name in. So I'm going to put bananas. You need to give me the price in. I'm going to put in whatever price. It's doing that same hint where it tells me this is what this information here is actually associated with. You don't have to write the attribute name with a colon in JavaScript. It is just giving me that hint. But now I've got a grocery object, and this thing works just like the object we had before. I can say my grocery.name to refer to that name attribute. I can even use those functions that we wrote attached to it, things like the get name, get price. And just like our string that we saw before, these are going to be dot functions because they're attached to this template up here. When I run my program, you can see it prints out the bananas and the 99 cents that I had passed in. They all get stored in this grocery object here. And my editor even knows that this thing is a grocery object and that that's a more specific category than just some general object. So that is objects in classes. The last little example that I do want to give you is kind of a compound of two very common things that I see people messing up when they're coming from another language and learning JavaScript, or even when JavaScript's the only language they know and they're just hammering away and they've been coding for 4 hours. And that is two features of how keywords are used in JavaScript. And both of these, we're going to use a for loop as our example. So if you've forgotten, for loops let us repeat everything for each element in a collection. So I might say, let each piece of my data pieces array that we used earlier. Data pieces, if you recall, was that array that had the square brackets. It has the apple and the 199 in that array. When I say for let piece of data pieces, then this is going to repeat this loop once for each element of that array. So the next piece is piece. When I go and I run this program, it's going to tell me, okay, first time through, it's apple. Next time through, it's that number that was in that second slot of the array. So that works pretty much like we'd expect. It's how for loops work in almost every language. There is another type of for loop in JavaScript, and it looks almost identical, but it changes one little word. For let piece in data pieces. If I change the word of to in, then what I'm doing is not iterating over the values of an array. For of iterates over the values of an array. For in actually iterates over the keys of an array. This also is true of objects. You can loop over each attribute in a JavaScript object. Of is going to give you the things on the right of the colon. In is going to give you the things on the left of the colon, which for an array, if we're doing this on an array, each one of these pieces, if I run it, first time is going to be the number 0, then is going to be the number 1. It's actually giving me the index of the slots of the array. And that's because secretly JavaScript arrays aren't really arrays. They do have keys and values, more like a map. But first time the index will be 0. Next. Then it will be 1. That is one really important thing to keep in mind. If you want to loop, you probably 9 times out of 10 want to use of here, not in. In some other languages, in is just the only one you get, so it's a really easy mistake to make. Next thing I want to show you is another question that I always get whenever I teach anyone JavaScript, especially if they've learned it somewhere else or have been exploring the internet, which is the word let and the word var. Both of these let us declare a variable, and you see in this file, all I've been using has been let. Right now with let, we get what's called lexical scoping, which means let is going to exist until the first unmatched curly brace. So here I've got my for loop. Let is described as part of the for loop. I declare it right here. So it's going to keep living until this curly brace right here. Normally, for most variables, this means it's going to live to the end of a function or the end of the loop that it was made in. However, now in this extra line after the loop, if I try to use this thing and I say, what's in piece, and I print it out here, my program's going to crash. I get this reference error here. Cannot find the variable piece. It ceased to exist right when it hit this closing curly brace. This will crash the program. Piece is already junked. It's been garbage collected. It's gone. It is no more. However, if I wrote the same exact loop, and instead of let, I used the word var. Remember, within, the first time through, it's going to be 0. The next time through, it's going to be 1. I don't even need a body in here. I don't need to do anything. If I console.log again and say, if we use var, the value saved in piece is. What var does is what's called hoisting. So with var, variables get hoisted to the top of the function they were declared in. So in this case, remember there's this secret invisible function that's covering my entire file. That means it's as if I had taken this and way back on line 1 of my file, the very first thing I did was write let pieces. Dropped it right there, actually var pieces, because it's not let, it is still using var when it hoists with var. But what that means is this thing is going to continue to exist no matter where we declared it, all the way to the end of the function. And if I run my program, even though I'm after the loop is over, the curly brace was right here, that variable continues to persist. It still exists and I can use it after it's gone stale. And generally, this is not what we want. We generally don't want this. If you're writing a variable and you do actually need it to live that long, you can always declare it in a spot where it will live that long. You don't lose anything by switching to let. You might need to be more careful about where you are writing your variables and actually first using them. But with var, it becomes very, very easy to accidentally use something after you thought it would be there. And so that is just a little stumbling block that I did want to bring up, that and the in versus the of. But here you can see we've done a lot of basic tasks in JavaScript. We have worked with string data, seen that there are methods attached to it. We have looked at the basics of interacting with arrays, pulling things in, splitting up a string into an array. We've written functions and called those functions, written JavaScript objects, and then created actual classes to be templates for those objects. This is the type of programming that I am assuming we're all starting from. So if there's a point in this video that you found it was hard to follow along, then I strongly recommend giving the MDN docs a read through. However, that is everything that I've got for you. Hopefully this review was valuable to you, and I'll catch you all in the next one.